welcome back to Metflex and Chill. This is Rachel Greger, your host, and I am here with one of my very best friends, Danny Vega. What's up, Danny?
So good to catch up, especially on a podcast. It's the best time to catch up.
Yeah, I know. You were actually you and Maura were one of the first on the show back in March. I can't believe, it feels like it was yesterday, and it was, I don't know, over 6 months ago. I can't.
It's a weird feeling. Yeah, it's been over 6 months, and we were one of the first ones, and it does feel like yesterday, but it also feels like a year ago. It's both.
Yeah, especially in 2020 with everything going on. I feel like we recorded right before everything started with COVID and all that. It was right before that started, or maybe right when it started. So anyway, if the listeners, so you were on the episode, and I'll link the episode that we did previously in the show notes. So anybody who didn't listen to that one, go check it out. But do you want to just give our listeners a little bit of your background, just a quick intro if they haven't listened to that already?
Yeah, so I played college football at Columbia University, got my master's in physiology. The name of the master's program was Human Performance at the University of Florida. And I spent the first half of that, a little bit less than half, working with football in the weight room. And then I had a great promotion that was available to me. They offered it in the basketball facility. So I started assisting with basketball, and I designed the programs for men's and women's tennis and men's and women's golf. And then we won the national championship, and our assistant head coach went off to VCU, and he took me with him. It was perfect timing. So I was the head strength coach at VCU basketball. Did that for a year and a half, and then left the whole field for over 10 years, did pharma sales, medical device sales, and then that passion came back when I started the ketogenic diet. I just, felt that passion for nutrition and fitness come back. And so 2 years after that, I quit my job. We started Fat Fuel Family Podcast. And so a lot of the time I always say, I spent a lot of the time looking at the performance side of things, and of course building muscle on a low carb and a ketogenic diet. And then we've also spoken a lot about, doing it with the family. We came out with that program that we did.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much it. Nowadays we're still as interested in that stuff, but we also, just like you've been branching out, we've been branching out, talking about other topics like parenting and relationships and what else? Yesterday we had Suzanne Venker on. This woman's amazing. She's just a very interesting author. She wrote about the flip side of feminism, and just kind of some of the things that women are told that make them more miserable. So really, really cool stuff. But I mean, yeah, that's pretty much me in a nutshell.
Awesome. So I do want to dive into some of the things you just mentioned, though, about building muscle and women, especially.
Yeah.
So that's a perfect segue. So like I mentioned when we were talking off air, I do have some questions here from the listeners. So let me just pull them up. So I basically just asked, what does everybody want to know about building muscle, as a general topic? And so we got a bunch of really good questions. And are you cool with just kind of going through these, chatting about them? There's a few really common ones, especially in the realm of building muscle and thinking about also obviously there's both females and males who listen to this show, but I do want to talk a little bit about kind of the female part of it as well, because I think that there's a lot of not fear, but with women. I know for myself, we can talk about this, I'm going through a muscle building phase. I'm in a slight surplus. It's a little scary watching the scale go up, but obviously I'm doing it strategically. I have a coach that I work with, and so I just want to kind of chat about that. But there's some questions related to that, so we'll get into it. So
Awesome.
Are you cool with that? And I also want to talk about your recent cut too. So
Yeah. But real quick, before we get into it, can you tell me, is it a weekly thing that you're bumping up the calories, or, I mean, is there an amount of calories that you're going up every week?
Yeah, so I am basing it off of how the scale is looking on a weekly average basis, and then also measurements. And we'll talk about this because this is one question, which maybe we can, well, we'll get to that question, but
Okay.
and then I'll answer this question. In
Okay,
that
good.
question.
Good,
I just
good,
don't
good.
want to go out of order because then I'll just like forget where I am.
Yeah, that works.
Okay, cool. Okay, so the first question, which is kind of a broad question, but maybe we can just chat a little bit about it. And this is in regards to building muscle. So someone asked, where should I start? How much lifting and how much cardio?
Oh, that's a good one. Well, I think it's important to have a good cardio base. And so, like, even if you're trying to put on muscle, you should have a good cardio base. You're going to need that to have the work capacity to handle the volume that you're going to need to build muscle. You know, like when I was doing, you know, there's two sides of that. When I was doing like concurrent training, so like, you know, hybrid training, like doing like distance with lifting, I noticed that, you know, putting on muscle wasn't really something that I could do because I couldn't get the volume in on the lifting side without compromising my recovery. So, in that sense, I was more focused on strength. But cardio, I mean, it doesn't have to be anything crazy. Literally, if you could walk for 20, 30 minutes a day minimum, that's good. You know, and then as far as where to start with lifting, I think it all depends where you're coming from. If you're someone who was like previously a cardio bunny and you weren't lifting at all, then I would start with like 2 to 3 days a week. And then over the course of like maybe a month or two, like one good little training cycle of like a month or two, maybe 4 to 6 weeks, bump that up to 3 to 4 days, just because, you know, you're going to see gains no matter what. Now, if it's someone who's already been lifting and is used to lifting 3 to 4 times a week, I think 4 times a week is great. I'm a big fan of high frequency when it comes to like what you're doing. So I usually don't really do like a day whereas I just train one muscle part, you know. Most of the time I'm doing, you know, a little bit of everything every day. So I usually start with like a lower body exercise. I just love starting my workouts with that. And then depending on what that day is, whether it's like, you know, vertical pressing or horizontal pressing or horizontal pulling, horizontal pressing, you know, I just have like a checklist of things that I know I need to have. And there's certain things like, for example, like pulling movements, any type of rowing. I like to do a lot more volume of that versus pushing. I think that's very applicable for women. I could tell you, like with Maura, she loves to really focus on her shoulders and her lats and her glutes. So like if you're trying to build a certain look, you have to keep that in mind. So you might need extra volume on the shoulders, extra volume on the lats, extra volume on the glutes, especially if you don't want to grow your legs as much as you want to grow your glutes, which is something that a lot of women are looking to do right now. But yeah, I think that's as far as cardio, I don't think there's any hit necessary right now. That's something that you can do at a later time if you're trying to cut. But having a good cardio base, you know, walking every day, doing some light rowing. I love rowing. And then lifting 3 to 4 times a week. But we can get into more details as far as like the volume and the exercise selection and all that.
Yeah, and I love that, and I totally agree. I actually recorded. It'll be a few weeks ago now that I recorded an episode that goes into all things cardio. So I talk about all the different energy systems and how to like break that down, and in as much layman terms as I can. But it's exactly what you said. Like having that aerobic base is super important. But if anybody hasn't listened to that episode, it's called Clearing Up the Cardio Confusion. So I'll link it in the show notes. But I like dove into everything that you just mentioned in just a little bit more detail in terms of cardio and how a lot of people tend to either go to both sides, right? They either abuse cardio and think that it needs to be, you know, every single day, like an hour on the treadmill, whatever, and then on the other end of things, underutilize it, right? So I feel like, especially with the clients that I work with, like when they first come to me, it's one end of the spectrum usually, and it's hard to find people who are in the middle, and I think that middle ground is really, especially with building muscle, is really important. And there's a lot of misconceptions behind, especially when you are building muscle, like you shouldn't be doing any cardio, which I just, like you said, I don't think that's practical because you're not going to be building that aerobic base to be able to maintain and sustain the volume that you need to be able to grow and build and all of that. So yeah, we can dive into some more specifics. I think we'll probably pull those out as we go through, as we go through some of these questions as well.
Okay.
So, but yeah, that was a really good kind of overall because I feel like there's so many things to go into with this, so I don't want to go down too many rabbit holes. But let's just move on to the next question, and then this will kind of answer the end of the other one. So
Okay.
someone said, they said types of progressive overload to build muscle.
I like that.
Yeah. So do you want to tackle it?
Yeah, so like progressive overload, that's like the first thing we learn, like, in undergrad, about you always need to have, add a load, and it's not just the load, it's not just the weight that you're doing. So different ways to progress yourself. There's, just off the top of my head, of course, the first one would just be to add more weight if you're able to do more weight. I'm a big believer in building strength versus testing strength. So I'm not gonna be always trying to lift higher weight. I'm always like, I can say, if I was able to do this weight 6 times with perfect form, and now I'm able to do it 10 times with perfect form, I'm getting stronger, and I'm going to be building muscle. So I don't have to go up in weight. You can look at increasing the density of your training. So adding supersets, and then a great way to do that without like hurting your recovery would be to pair antagonistic muscle groups together. So like doing a rowing movement with a pressing movement. So that way, even if you're trying to get more work done in less time, the actual time that muscle that was worked is resting is still a good amount. So there's that. So you're building up density, you're increasing the reps of something. And then just I mean, before all of that, I think the most important thing before we get into like how to increase the weight and increase the load is just making sure that every rep looks exactly the same. Like if you were to film yourself, 5 weeks in a row and put those videos on top of each other, they should all look like it's just one video, because you have to standardize the stimulus. If you don't, why would you add weight? You're not really doing the prescribed amount of reps perfectly now, then why would you add weight later? And that's something that we get impatient. We want to increase the weight, we want to do more, but honestly, there was something that was a big eye-opener for me this year in January. I basically didn't see our friend Ben for like the whole month. He was traveling, and he came back and he saw me and he was like, man, you look great. You look bigger. You put on some muscle. And I said, you know what? All I've been doing is focusing on execution, because I'm 39 and I'm looking at videos from just 2017 of the stuff that I used to do, and I'm like, crap, I can't do some of that anymore already, which is kind of crazy. So if it wasn't for me perfecting my execution, I wouldn't be able to do that, because my volume is not where it used to be. And so, if you're able to do less volume of something, but you can execute it better, then the quality of the work is better, which is good. It's good news.
Yeah, I agree too, because that's something I've also been focusing on, especially the last few months, is the execution part of it. Because you can, like for example, if you're squatting, right, and you want to add weight to the bar, like, yeah, you can add weight and feel, or on paper it might look like you're progressing, right, like on your logbook, which is one thing that if you're not tracking your workouts, that's the first thing like you have to do, because a lot of people just don't do that. Then how do you know if you're progressing, right, from week to week? So you have to be tracking your sets, reps, load, all of that. But it's easy to, put a little weight on the bar, and then, for example, your squat. If you're squatting, let's just say 2 parallel, and then you put some weight on the bar and you squat, but it's just above parallel, and then that happens week after week, and your range of motion is becoming less and less and less. It might look like on paper that you're adding weight, but you're not doing the same amount of work, because you're not getting to what you said. You're not executing it like you were the first week, right? So something that I've really been focusing on is making sure that my start and my end points are always the same. So the start of the concentric and the end of the eccentric, just to kind of put this into words on a podcast, if you're doing a bicep curl, right, like you want to make sure that the start point is, your arm completely straight, so your tricep flexed, and then you come up and you have like an endpoint. So whether that's, if you're doing like a dumbbell curl, the dumbbell curl coming like to your nose or whatever, and then coming back down, flexing your tricep, and then doing it again, like making sure you're getting that full range of motion. And there's other things like that go into that as well, when you're, you know, focusing on different angles. But I think the biggest thing is just know your start and end point, and then make sure that you are starting and ending at the same place for every single rep. And that's really helped me, just like with that focus, because I know that I'm doing the same amount of work, and then I know for sure, like, if I'm adding weight or if I'm adding a rep, like, it's a good quality rep, or, you know, good quality, right? So
Yeah, and there's one more thing. I mean, that's along those same lines. Like, you have to understand, like, at least a little bit of understanding of how the muscle works. So, like, you know, a muscle cannot contract fully if the joint that it's on is moving around, you know, and that's what happens when, if we use the bicep curl, for example, you know, you may even be kind of, you know, starting and ending at the same point. But if you're starting to, like, do, like, you know, some, like, a front raise, if you're starting to bring other muscles into it, like even the squat example where you got a bar on your back, there's a lot of ways that our bodies can get the movement done and bring it up, and then we're not even working the muscles that we're just finding ways to compromise, and then we're inculcating these flawed patterns that become habits, and then we wonder, man, why haven't I put on muscle? Or it could also be that your anatomy is not suited for the actual exercise. You know, that's why I love Ben's, you know, SSI. We always set up for our anatomy. So, for example, on a squat, for me, I have super long femurs. And so for me to get to the angle that I need to get to really hit my quads, you know, I'm going to have to elevate my heels. And then from there, we stabilize. So we that's where we talk about the joints are not moving. So if it's like, you know, if it's a shoulder joint, if you're doing like a lateral raise, if you start to see like you're shrugging or something, then that joint's moving. You're no longer isolating the shoulder. And then initiate. The way you initiate the movement, that ensures that you're getting the contraction at every length of the contraction. So, like, you know, if we're talking about that bicep curl, you mentioned flexing the tricep before you start. If you just flex the tricep, you'll notice right away that your bicep will flex at the same time, and you'll feel that contraction at the very at the insertion, you know, so at the very end of that where it attaches to the bone. And that's where you get those really good contractions, not just in the shortened position where we're used to, but in the lengthened position. And like that's where bodybuilding, I love bodybuilding, because they understand like angles and they understand tension. And like we need to understand, like, for you to really build that muscle as big as it can be, you want to use that movement for the entirety of the movement, not just the shortened position, because then you're missing out.
Yeah, for sure. I completely agree. I think, and this is something that I've just been getting into a lot lately over the last few months, is just the same thing. Like, I'm just getting super interested in all of this, all of this stuff.
We might see you on the stage, Rachel.
We'll see. Maybe I think about it, and then I just go back and forth. But I think, like, right now, I'm just, like I said, I'm focusing on putting on as much muscle.
Put on muscle, that's it.
Yeah. So we'll see where that goes. But yeah, I think the biggest thing too is just like you said, film yourself, right? Like, if you have no idea what you're doing, you know, I do this all the time. Like, I just put my phone on, you know, the selfie view or whatever.
Yep.
And I record, I stick it in my, you know, I don't know, against my water bottle, or prop it up somewhere and just record myself just to see my form. And if if you're not seeing yourself, or if you're not working with a coach like in person, then it's going to be a lot harder to even know what you're doing. So I would say that would be probably the first step.
Yes.
Like, if you're stagnant, if you're not seeing progress, and you're like, feel like you're doing everything right, then film yourself, see what's going on. Get an outside set of eyes looking on, like hire a coach or something to help you, even if it's a, you know, for me, I have, like I mentioned, I have my own coach, and I send him form videos all the time, because I want to get feedback, right? I want to have an outside set of eyes looking at it and saying, oh, like, maybe adjust this or adjust that, or change your foot angle here, or whatever it is. So I think that's super, super important. So
I totally agree. We get into our comfort zones, and we just don't we just assume that we're doing what we need to do, and it's a lot of the time it's not the case, especially if we're stuck.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. All right. So the next question is, how often do you need to switch up lifting routines so that you don't plateau?
So, I mean, periodization is super important. It doesn't matter what type of periodization you use. I mean, you could even use a typical standard Western periodization, which is usually like you're going to start with a muscle building phase. Let's say you do that for like 3 to 4 months, and then you go into a strength phase for maybe like, let's say 2 months. Then from there, you can go into like a quick maintenance just for like a month or so. You can do like a 2-month cut, and then there's always has to be at least a short maintenance period after that, and then build back up to putting on muscle, and the training should reflect that. So as we're adding muscle, our volume is going to be super high, and then as we're adding strength, our volume might drop as far as the sets and reps go, but the weight is going higher. It's super important to do, but it's not important to do just for the sake of doing it, because there's like, I think a lot of people just start saying, well, I'm just going to switch it up. I'm going to switch up my routine. And I can tell you, like, I've been doing this for 26, 27 years almost. And there's certain exercises to this day that I still use, and I find them just as good as I did a long time ago, especially if you've found a way to execute them better. Like, for example, leg extension. That's an exercise I stayed away from for so many years because it's an open chain movement, and we always were told in school that that's not good if you have a knee injury or a shoulder injury, for example. You want to do closed chain movements, but if you execute it the right way, I've noticed that I don't have any pain, and I actually feel a better contraction that way. So definitely, it's cool to see new programs. Like Maura has right in front of me that book, the what's his name? The Brett Contreras. Yeah, that big old Brett Contreras book. I mean, super well written. He's got a bunch of programs, and so that's just one example. Like, do the whole program, commit to the program, and don't just. I've seen even with clients of mine where they do a program of mine and then they do a program of someone else, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think a lot of people don't. They're just program hopping. And there's no rhyme or reason to it. I think it's important to ask questions if someone's working with you as a coach. Like, if your coach gets annoyed at your questions, then that's a little bit of a yellow flag, because, you should be able to explain why something's there, and it should have something to do with you. I mean, it should have something to do with your anatomy and your current abilities. So I can tell you, like, for me, for example, with Keto Muscle Intelligence, we give a new program, like a new training program every month, but the principles don't change. Like, we're still doing 3 weeks of like standard programming with a fourth like recalibrate week where things are a little bit different. So building in, this is especially true if you're like a strength athlete. I know we're not talking about strength specifically today, but for me, when I first started powerlifting, I was like, well, I'll just deload when I'm tired. But by the time you're tired, it's too late. You're already overreaching. You're probably getting close to overtraining. So building in deloads and even building in adequate rest. A lot of people are like, well, I don't have time to do that, or I don't feel like I'm working as hard if I'm resting. What you notice is that if you do give yourself adequate rest, you're going to be able to switch on and hit it harder during the set. It's a little bit of an adjustment because we're so used to doing like 50 things at once. So, I wouldn't recommend, obviously browsing Instagram or anything like that in between sets, really trying to just rest in between sets, clear your mind, and then switch it on right before you start, set your intentions and get back into it. And that's like training for life, because that's helping us switch back and forth from parasympathetic to sympathetic, which is going to help us with recovery. It's why like those walks we talked about are great to be done after a workout, like doing like a 20 to 30 minute walk after you train. If you don't have the time, no problem, but that's just a good reason why we like to do that.
Yeah, for sure. I completely agree. And I love what you said about even for the programs, like the principles stay the same. There's a saying, I'm probably going to butcher this, but it's principles are few, methods are many. Have you heard that?
Yes. Oh, who said that? Oh man, who
I
said
know,
that?
I can't remember who said it, but it's so true. And that's like, for example, like that's how I program for my clients, and now how I follow like training programs. It's always like I have like metric based lifts, which are always the first part of the workout, and those are, focusing on the compound lifts, so squat, deadlift.
Is that percentage based or like some sort of
What do you mean? Like, is it based on my 1 rep max?
Yeah, like, are you doing that, or I just because
So-
you said metric based?
So when I say metric based, I just mean like the specific like exercise that I am tracking like week to week, month to month throughout
Okay.
every mesocycle. Like that's not changing. Like I'm always squatting. I'm always doing some type of deadlift. I'm always doing some type
Yes.
of horizontal press, horizontal pull. Horizontal press, horizontal pull, vertical press, vertical pull. Like those types of movements. Those are always like the metric based movements where
I love it.
you're basically tracking them to make sure you are progressing in them, right? And then you have like more accessory movements and more isolation movements, which those things are like the more like the smaller muscle groups, or the isolation movements, where those things you can kind of switch up a little bit more because they're
Yeah.
not, not that they're not as important, but they can just, you can make them a little bit more fun, like your lateral raises or your bicep curls. Like you can do tons of different variations of that, but as long as you have like your, like I call them metric based movements as your foundation and as the principles, that's going to be something that's super important. Because if you're not, again, it comes back to the progressive overload. Like if you're not continuing to do that like over the course of months, like how do you know if you're progressing? Like if you did a back squat last month and then this month you're doing, I don't know, a hack squat, those are still good movements, but you want to make sure that you're progressing, because how do you know the same load that you're doing on the hack squat is the same load that you're doing on the back squat? Like there's nothing wrong with that. And that's another thing you said about, anatomy, right? So some people just, I don't think, there's a thing too, like, and this is what I always thought too with like back squatting, like it's like everybody needs to back squat, right? But unless you're like training for like a powerlifting competition or something like that, you don't need to back squat to build muscle.
I totally agree.
Right?
Totally agree. And like, if you're someone like me, or if you look at NFL players, like a lot of them don't put a bar on their backs,
Yeah.
because there's other things too. There's like injury, there's your history, and then maybe you find like a hack squat. I mean, I do a lot more hack squats nowadays than back squats, but I do, like, I challenge myself, or sometimes I'll do one-legged hack squats, and that, for hip stability, like really challenging that hip stability, it's really good.
Yeah, for sure. Like I've been progressing my single leg safety bar split squats, which
Oof.
is another kind of thing that we can talk about too in terms of bilateral movements versus unilateral, and making sure that you
Huge.
are incorporating
Very
some
important.
unilateral work.
Yes.
But those suck, but they're very, very like they're like one of those things that you hate doing, but after you do them, you're like, I definitely felt that, and it was hard as hell, but it felt good.
Plus,
I did those
you
yesterday.
you get to expose your lateral like what do you call those differences between like one side or the other, like imbalances.
Yes,
Lateral
imbalances.
imbalances are probably
I knew what you were trying to say. I'm like, I can't think of it either. Imbalances, yeah.
yeah, those are probably more important than like front to back imbalances, like, and that's one that we all need to be aware of. Like, people tend to train what they see in the mirror. So I mean, guys don't do as much hamstrings as they do quads, or as much back as they do chest, and that leads to postural issues. But it's even more important with like right to left, because the body's a kinetic chain, and if that one left leg is much weaker than the right leg, then you start to see like that maybe you have an issue in your left knee because it's weak, because your left quad is not as strong, and so now you start to overcompensate, and you start to feel issues in your right lower back, and then you start to feel issues in your left shoulder. It just moves up the chain. So the unilateral stuff is so important to bring it in, for sure. I do that a lot. Plus, a lot of it is like core stuff too. So if you're doing single arm shoulder press, that's going to be great, trunk stability movement. So I love that stuff. I think it's always got to be in there for sure.
Yeah, for sure. I completely agree. And I think also, like you said, like program hopping and things like that, like there needs to be some structure behind what you're doing. And if you don't have that structure, like it's just going to be so hard to progress because you don't know what you're trying to progress with, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's super important. And yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you said. Okay, so let's get into the next question. Okay, so this is kind of what I was mentioning before. Reasonable fat gain while trying to build muscle. Any rule of thumb?
I don't know if I've ever looked at like a percentage body fat that's acceptable, but I think that the in my experience, it all depends on the type of person. Because I'm going to talk about myself, but then I'm going to also think about that hard gainer that needs to just add a ton of calories, for example. But like, you don't need that much of a surplus, and that's why I was asking you, because I was just wondering, how many calories, like, are you bumping it up by like 100, 200 calories? Because I've noticed that, especially coming off a cut, if you just start adding at the beginning, pushing those calories back up. Let's assume that you've already done a reverse diet, and so you're at some sort of baseline now. Adding, let's say, 200 calories a week, but observing your weight gain. So I don't think anywhere from like 2 to 3 pounds a week is probably as high as you want to go, especially if you're a woman, because women tend to be lighter than men as it is. And just being intentional about your food. Like, if you are eating more calories and it's good food, then chances are you're not going to gain that much fat. And I would assume that you could put on a good, in a good 3-month period, maybe you put on 5% body fat, but I mean, your overall muscle that you put on, your lean body mass, is greater. And so now you just have to be very, very careful when you go to cut again, that you don't lose that lean body mass. And I think that's where we have the issues. Like, I would just, again, on assumption, guys are probably gonna, when it's time to bulk, it's like, all right, it's time to bulk. So a guy's gonna be like automatically, and I'm sure guys do this with the cutting too, where they just like, okay, it's time to cut. If I'm bulking, I'm just gonna add 500 calories right off the bat, or just go ham, and then all of a sudden a month later they're like, what did I do? And the same thing could happen for the cutting. Then you're just spinning your wheels because you're cutting calories too much. You got sick of the way you looked in the mirror. You keep looking at yourself in that, those summer photos, where you were so much leaner. And you just have to always keep that perspective in the time that you are. Like, I am in a muscle building phase, like, which I will be after this cut, and I'm just I'll stay in maintenance for maybe like a month, and then I'll push those calories back up. But you have to do that, and I think people get impatient on both sides, but women probably more impatient on the side we're talking about, where we're like, okay, I'm putting on some weight. I mean, your weight gain, especially over the winter, is not going to be as noticeable, because you'll be covered up anyways. So it's the best time to do that. Like, just commit to the when you're doing what you're doing, commit to it and stay committed to it, and don't worry about anything else after. Don't be reminiscing about, you're going to lose that weight again. It's just, you got to be in the moment where you're training,
Yeah, exactly. And you have to commit to it. And I think, and I'll kind of talk about a little bit of my experience so far from being in, I guess this is probably like my first, like, quote unquote real building phase. The last, I think it's like been, I think I'm coming on like 3 months now, or 4 months. I don't even know what month it is anymore. But I committed to it, right? And like, I took time to talk it through with my coach and say, okay, like, I'm committing to these next 6-8 months of building muscle, knowing that the scale is going to go up, because this is something that took me a little while to come to terms with too. It's like, muscle weighs something.
It's denser.
Right? It's not just like
denser.
Miraculously doesn't weigh anything, right?
Yep.
And yes, we can get into body recomposition and losing body fat and building muscle at the same time, and that is something that especially happens with, if you're kind of like a newbie, right? You're new to lifting, or you've never dieted before, you're just going into, you know, a dieting phase or whatever. Like, a lot of my clients do body recomp, right? And that's what happened with me in my transformation. Like, I was able to lose body fat and build muscle at the same time because I wasn't following any structured program before that, and that, like, I was able to gain muscle and lose body fat. But by the end of that, in this last kind of year, I realized that I kind of had squeezed out all of my body recomposition potential, and I got to a weight that I was like, I don't want this weight to go down anymore, and I'm not seeing really exactly what I want to see in terms of, you know, like my muscle, right? And so I was like, all right, I need to go into a building phase. I need to spend time there. And I think that the biggest thing to realize is that the scale is going to go up. It has to go up, right? But like you said, it's not like, oh, you're just going to go out and eat a ton of food and, like, you know, tell yourself you're in a gaining phase so it doesn't matter. That's definitely the wrong way to do it. So just a little bit in terms of this question said, is there any kind of rule of thumb of how much weight or how much fat to gain while trying to build muscle? So for me, what I've been going off of is I've been looking at my weekly average weight, right, and using that, not the day-to-day average. Not the daily fluctuations in weight, because we know that can be so arbitrary in terms of what's going on. But the weekly averages and even the bi-weekly averages, mostly looking at that. That's better.
Yeah, it's like trends.
Yeah, exactly. And then also just paying attention to body tape measurements, so making sure that I'm doing those every week. And so for me, the goal has been to gain between 0.25 and 0.5% of my body weight per week. And so staying within that range. But this also depends, too, on how much body fat you have, I think. So the more body fat you have, the higher that percentage can go. So for me, just as an example, that's like what I've been kind of basing off of. And that gives me, you know, if I'm going over that 0.5%, like maybe on a 2-week basis, I see the scale kind of jump over that, then I know, okay, I just need to, like, pull it back a little bit and reassess. But at the same time, I think that this is why it's so important to have a coach. And, like, even for myself, like, I don't think that I would be comfortable doing this alone without having that outside perspective, because he definitely, like, reels me in. And it's like, okay, like, you need to see the scale go up. That is part of building muscle, like you said. And the what you're doing now, though, like, seeing the scale go up now and having this this number that you see on the scale is not the same number that you saw when you were maybe that weight, for example, for me 2 years ago, right? It's a different body composition. And another thing you have to realize, too, is that like, for every pound, like, it's impossible to gain muscle without gaining a little bit of fat, right? Like, it's nearly impossible. I'm pretty sure it's impossible. But what you can focus on is that every pound that you gain, you want there to be a significant amount of muscle in that pound. There's still going to be some fat, but you want there to obviously be muscle. And the only way that that can happen is if you are lifting, right, and building that stimulus and resistance training and all of that, eating enough protein, all of that, recovering properly. And there's something called the P ratio. Have you heard of that before?
P ratio? You're not talking about protein and energy? What Ted
No, it's just basically the kind of the ratio of fat to muscle that you're gaining.
Oh, I like that.
So you want, like I said, within the pound of whatever that pound is that you're gaining, you want there to be a significant amount of muscle being gained alongside with a little bit of fat rather than the reversal. Because we know that if you do put on too much fat, right, if you are, like, going into a quote-unquote dirty bulk, like, that's not going to be advantageous for you in terms of, you know, building muscle efficiently and effectively, and not having to, you know, look back 8 months from now and have gained, like, you know, 40 plus pounds or whatever, and try to cut that back down. So anyway, it's
so hard to do that, man. It's so hard to do that, like, when you've gained that much weight, you know, because then, you know, you tend to get more aggressive on the cut, and then again you're losing more muscle. So then, you know, it's like you went too aggressive in both directions, and then here we are back at square one.
Yeah. I think, though, just committing to it is super important, and especially for a woman, like, knowing that the scale is going to go up, and, like, just becoming okay with that is super important. So, and then again, working with someone so that you can, you know, be be okay with that, I guess. And it's never gonna, like, you're gonna go back and forth between like accepting it and then not accepting it. Like for myself, I've put on almost 7 to 8 pounds since my last cut.
But it was what, 3 months?
4 months now.
Yeah, I mean, come on, that's 2 pounds a month. That's not bad at all.
Yeah, but I've been strategic with it, right? I mean, there have been some, like a few weeks where I've overshot a little bit, but I just make sure that I'm dialed in. And it's like my coach actually used the saying, like, it's like a turtle coming at you, like to attack you. Like you see it from so far away, but it takes so long to get to you that you can make changes. So a lot of people think like, oh my gosh, like I'm gonna just gain these 20 pounds back overnight if I go into a surplus. Like, no, that doesn't happen, especially if you're tracking these metrics week to week. Like you're tracking your body weight, you're tracking your body tape measurements, you're taking progress pictures, things like that. So anyway.
That's good too. Like those progress pics, like progress pictures, measurements, body fat measurements beyond just the weight. Those are also helpful, you know, because you might find that even at the end of this, at the end of this muscle building phase, and then at the end of the subsequent cut, you don't get down to the same weight you got to on your last cut. But then you look at the pictures and you see the measurements and you see the body fat, and those three are all telling you that you put on muscle. You're just heavier now. Deal with it, you know?
And that's another thing I came to realize too, is like, I want to be heavier. Like there was this time where I was like, you know, and I think a lot of women go through this too, like they want to see the scale continue to go down. They want to get to this lower number. And I've completely shifted my perspective on that. Like I want to see the scale go up as much as possible and have the body composition I want, because the more I weigh, the more I can eat.
Yeah. Like
right?
Tara, did you hear what Tara said? What's Tara's last name?
Garrison?
Yeah, Garrison. She's like, muscles are calorie absorbers. Mm-hmm. So listen up, ladies. Put on some muscle. This is why I get to eat a lot. I get to, like, people look at my plate sometimes and they're like, you know, not when I'm cutting, but like, they're like 1,500 to 2,000 calorie plates, you know, and I'm not just eating one time a day. Yeah. So it's like, you get to eat more if you have more muscle.
Exactly.
And eating is fun.
Yeah, exactly. And you have to spend time, you know, building that muscle and put your body in the most optimal state to do that. If you are, you know, going back and forth between being at maintenance and being in a deficit and being in a surplus, like week after week and month after month, like that is not going to be advantageous. Like you said, you have to commit to the process, and that's why periodizing your nutrition is so important. So anyway, the next we're about, what are we, like 40 minutes in? So we have a few more. The next question was, this is this is a kind of broad one, but how do you build significant muscle on a low carb diet?
You know, that's a really good question, you know, because I always tell people, like, you know, when you do low carb, you might see that the total amount of weight that you gain, for example, is not as much, you know, like you know, but the quality may be better, you know. And so, you know, we talk about this, like, if you want to, the way we talk about it with Keto Muscle Intelligence is just super important to make sure that your training matches your diet. And, you know, if you're dieting a certain way and you're eating, you know, a low amount of carbohydrates, you don't want to be living in that glycolytic pathway in your training. You don't want to be doing those supersets with little rest and super high reps, because it's very stressful to your, you know, to your adrenals, and you don't have any carbs to help with that. So for the way I like to do it is most of the time we're going to be training, you know, in the 5 to 8 rep range. That's just how we like to do it. And then we're training like maybe with a little bit longer rest, like 2 minutes. But feel free to add in those, even if you wanted to do once a week, where you wanted to add, you know, like a high volume day where you're just bringing in a lot more volume. But on that day, put some carbs, you know, around your training, before, after. Like before, I'm always like, I'm a big fan of not having too many carbs before. So anything from 20 to 30 tops is more than enough. And then maybe more, maybe double that, or, you know, something like 60 to 100, depending on the person. Post workout, and then the rest of the day spacing out maybe two more meals with a little bit of carbs, so that you're not having you know blood sugar swings where you're starting to get cravings. But you can, especially if you're a beginner, you can get away with doing a lot of training, without carbing up, because you're gonna have those beginner gains that you spoke about, which a lot of people, they're just getting their bodies, healthy and stuff. So it takes a little bit longer because, when you're on a low carb diet, you don't have as many anabolic signals as you would with the carbs. Like we have what do you call it? Of course, we have growth hormone, and we have I'm thinking of that anabolic pathway that people always hate on because they think we're going to get cancer. mTOR, yeah. So we have mTOR, but now the mTOR signal's way higher, and added to it with insulin when the carbs. So your mTOR signal's stronger when you have carbs, and your insulin, that alone is very anabolic. The only thing is that insulin is not selectively anabolic. It's anabolic everywhere. It's anabolic in the muscle. It's anabolic in the fat cells. So just match your training to your diet. So don't just pick up any like old program from online. It makes sense to follow a program from someone who's on a ketogenic diet. Maybe it's someone whose physique you want to have. I mean, I know that can be problematic sometimes because some people are just freaks and they can get away with everything. I know that there was this guy that he was a really, really strong power lifter, but he was a terrible coach, and he was just, the things that he did, he was prescribing them to other people and people couldn't handle them. So of course you got to be aware of that, but it's totally possible. And I will say that you probably have to be more patient with a low carb diet if you're trying to add the maximum amount of muscle. I mean, there's always considering, I know it's crazy, maybe getting off of like a ketogenic style diet and then going into a low carb diet that's still low carb. You don't need that many carbs to really put on muscle. If I'm eating 200, if I'm eating my body weight in grams, like 225 grams of carbs, I mean, that is a lot of carbs, and it's more than enough, and it powers me through the workout. And so it's helpful, especially if you're training with carb people, because then you could keep up. Because sometimes, like when I'm doing those faster workouts, it happened to me a lot with Ben and other people we trained with. Like if they would have carbs and I was just stubborn and I didn't have carbs, like I would hit a wall and they wouldn't, And it's not always because you're weaker or something. It's just that, it gets to a point where, yes, especially if you're fat adapted, you can operate at a higher percentage of your VO2 max. But when that's like persistently happening in the workout, there might be a point at which your ability to kind of save that glycogen and, just preserve it because you're using fat, it goes away because your fat is not making that glucose at a fast enough clip.
Inflexible.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
So that's why it's okay to have, some carbohydrates. We're talking about performance. I think a lot of the times people start talking about health and then they mix it with performance, and it's like, let's make sure that we're talking about healthy people who are trying to put on muscle. Chances are that unless they are just adding muscle because they want to get stronger and they want to get healthier, those people may not need the carbs. But if you're someone who's already healthy, you might find that it just works well to add those carbs and to put on more muscle, because that's what happens. I think a lot of the time is people, maybe they start to get tapped out because there's just not enough, and it's just going to take longer. It's just going to take longer doing that way. So that's my complicated thoughts on low carb and building muscle.
I completely agree, and it comes back to the point of being metabolically flexible and being able to use the different fuel sources. And if you have been keto forever, right, for a long time, and then you're looking to increase your performance, or you've come to a plateau in your performance or your ability to put on muscle, like you need to make sure that you are matching the carbs to your training and paying attention to that. So yeah, super important. All right, we have 2 more questions. What's a good, and this will kind of go well with the last question, what's a good post-workout meal if you're following a keto diet?
Well, my post workout meal, I didn't have it. I didn't have enough time, but I love, since I train in the morning, I love to have, a lot of protein for sure. Protein is the highest thing, but the fat is pretty a good amount. So this one that I'm gonna have an 8 ounce, 92% ground beef, and then a carnivore scramble from Eat to Evolve, which is like eggs with I think it's like diced up ham and sausage and some reduced fat mozzarella because I love my cheese.
Yeah.
But like I'm not having any carbs with that one. So that's like about 37% protein and 62% fat. So it's 80 protein and 60 fat. You don't need a ton of fat after your workout. The more important thing is the protein. So fat, just like carbs, are energy, and protein is to build muscle tissue. So if you're trying to fast, just everybody agrees that after your training that amino acids are important, but no one seems to agree, and there's really not a lot of literature suggesting like how long you should wait. My rule of thumb, and I barely ever get to this point, is eat within 4 hours of stopping your training. Like a lot of the time, if I walk to the gym, by the time I get home, which is like 50 minutes later, I'm making my food, and so I'm eating like an hour within finishing my training. It all depends too, like on the type of person you are. If you are someone who you're really trying to put on muscle, you're a hard gainer, eat right after. Make sure you get a good amount of protein. If you're on a keto or a low carb diet, then make sure that you have a good amount of fat so you feel full. But it's really not, I don't think it's that complicated. I think that there's this one study, I haven't freaking been able to find it. I think Jacobs shared it like 4 years ago, and I haven't been able to find it. It was talking about like 3 different levels of how well these people, like how trained these people were. And so it's like a beginner might be able to still see a good amount of protein synthesis with like waiting like 12 hours, within training, but then as you get into more elite people, like even like these high-end athletes, the most that they would wait is 4 hours without compromising muscle protein synthesis. And if we want to be really thorough with it, and we want to be like conservative, then pulsing that protein a little bit more often instead of eating 2 meals a day, like breaking it down into 3 to 4 meals. I think that's something good for keto people to try regardless, because I noticed that I'm so used to having massive meals that when I've increased my frequency, I've had to really adjust to eating a smaller meal. And I think it's a good quality to have, to be able to enjoy a smaller meal and don't be busting at the seams every time. The literature is pretty clear. Like it's better to have that protein spaced out throughout the day if you're trying to build muscle.
Yeah, especially, when we're talking about digestion as well, and then also like talking about the leucine threshold and hitting that threshold, within as many times, throughout the day to stimulate muscle protein synthesis and put you in that anabolic state, which we can dive in. There's a lot of different camps behind that, but I do, like you mentioned, you were talking about like the anabolic window and eating, post-workout and stuff like that. I think it also depends on like, especially if your goal is to build muscle, it also depends on what your like intake was before. So like did you go into your training fasted? If so, you have less fuel available post-workout, right?
Great point.
Versus if you ate a pre-workout meal or a pre-workout snack, like that had a significant amount of protein in it, you still have those amino acids, in your system floating around, right? So available to you for, recovery. So I think a lot of people don't think about that either. They don't think about that. They think like, okay, your pre-workout meal, your snack, you had that, and all that fuel is going to just the workout, and then you don't have anything afterwards. That's not really how it works. Like digestion doesn't happen that fast. So that's one thing to think about too. So like if you did eat a good solid pre-workout meal, then you probably have more time post-workout to get your next meal in. And then also talking about like recovery purposes as well. And not just in terms of muscle protein synthesis, but also post-workout, we want to make sure that you're getting into that parasympathetic state, in a good amount of time, right? So
yep.
I think that's important to think about too in terms of, recovery and fueling appropriately, and then we can dive into we probably don't have that much time, but in terms of, this person said good post workout meal following a keto diet. A keto diet can be different for everybody, right, in terms of how many carbs someone can tolerate. So especially if you're following like a targeted keto diet where you're incorporating carbs pre and post workout like we talked about, or if you're going more to the low carb end and you're incorporating more carbs, like that's going to depend. So yeah, but I agree with what you said. And so this kind of goes into the recovery. This will be the last question. So someone said, I have adrenal fatigue and I've read that it's better to exercise before noon for cortisol levels. Any truth behind that?
Well, the way cortisol is supposed to work is it's supposed to be high in the morning, and as the day goes on, it's supposed to like go down. Mm-hmm. It's so complicated because it all depends on how far along you are with that adrenal, like whatever it is, dysregulation, fatigue. Mm-hmm. Because if you're at the point where you're flatlined already, I don't think it really makes much of a difference. You're gonna probably be feeling stressed. You're gonna probably feel weak and not have a lot of energy regardless. I think it's definitely I'm not a fan of training at night. I just know that for me it affects my sleep, and then it complicates things too with the training and the eating. Because if you're, I know a lot of people, it's the only time they can go. I don't know if training, what did she say, before noon?
Yeah,
or just in the morning?
Yeah. Is it better to exercise before noon for cortisol levels?
Well, I mean, cortisol is a good thing. Like having cortisol is important. It's a good thing, and it's probably part of why we wake up with some pep in the morning. Especially if you're doing like a cool down, like a proper cool down after that just doesn't keep those cortisol levels high. We've talked about how effective it is to train and have a little bit of carbs post workout for cortisol, because an insulin spike will bring down cortisol right away. So I don't know if you know, Rachel, but I've never heard of like with respect to training, like if it's better in the morning, but it makes sense to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it makes sense to me too, especially if you do have obviously you said adrenal fatigue, and it comes down to, like you said, where are you on that spectrum, and like what's cortisol is good in an acute sense, right? Like we need cortisol. A lot of people think cortisol is bad, but it's not bad. Like we need it. Yep. What's quote unquote bad is if you have chronically elevated cortisol all the time. That's the issue. That's where the adrenal fatigue and how people talk about that comes into place. But I mean, for me, I know like when I was living in Florida in West Palm Beach, I was training at night, and I remember my sleep just being so awful for like so long. And then when I moved to California, my schedule swapped, and I started training in the morning and like before noon. Now I train at lunchtime, which is around like 11. But it's just completely different. Like I can't train just like you. Like that's I
feel like that would be anywhere from 11 to 2 is like the perfect time to train if you had your choice. I wake up, I do my morning routine, and I walk to the gym. Nowadays, I'm walking to the gym like almost every day because of how I just need that extra activity. And it just works awesome for me. But if you're not used to it, it sucks. Yeah. But if you work from home, man, it's pretty awesome to use those morning hours. Unless motivation to train is a hard thing. Motivation to train for me is never like an issue. Unless I wait till the end of the day, then for me it's like not happening because I'm so used to training in the morning. But if you could do some work in the morning and then wait and then train before lunch, that's a good time to train.
Yeah, and if you can only train, like say you get off work at 5, like if you can only train right after work, like
that's a good time.
That's okay as long as you're adapting to that, and as long as you are, checking all the other boxes throughout the day, like you're recovering properly, you're getting enough fuel, all of that. So yeah, I would say probably more advantageous earlier in the day, but you kind of got to do what you got to do, right? It depends on your lifestyle. So yeah, cool. All right, so I do have one last question for you, which I'm sure you know this question already, putting you on the spot a little bit because I think I asked you this last time, but what is one thing that you've changed your mind about in the past year and why?
Yes, I remember you asked me that. Okay. One thing that I've changed my mind about in the last year.
It can be related to anything. It doesn't have to be like even nutrition or fitness or anything.
What it was? Help me.
Is Maura there?
Oh, okay.
Honestly, that's something that we've literally changed our mind.
Sorry, we got the peanut gallery over here is my wife. Is Maura's over here. I'm thinking, yeah, like that's definitely, it's interesting. It's a political thing, but it's actually, international trade. This is just random, but like international trade and like open markets, I've always been like a huge fan of that. But just like seeing everything that happened with China with the virus, for example, and when I learned how dependent we are, like I think 80% of our medical stuff, like our equipment, our medications are coming from China. And that to me is concerning nowadays, especially if they become our enemies. So like I've gotten cozier with the idea of manufacturing in this country. I know it's not related to anything, but
No.
I think it's it's kind of cool to see like if it's possible and doable to bring stuff back here, and to like I remember in 2008 we used to have plants in Puerto Rico for pharmaceuticals, and all of those went overseas. A lot of things changed, during those years, and those were jobs that we lost. But it's also the security part that I didn't think of before, is like if we are making it, we're not dependent on other countries. That's helpful. So that's one that it's funny, I was thinking about it the whole time, and I was like, I'm not going to bring it up. And then when Maura said it, I was like, okay, fine. Yeah, I was thinking about that one. Yeah.
Tell her that I'm going to have her come on and do a solo with me.
Rachel says she wants to have you back and do a solo with her. She says, let's do it.
All right. I'll text her. Awesome. All right. Well, I think we went through all the questions, and this was awesome. So do you want to tell our listeners where they can find you, your website, your podcast, social media, all that jazz?
Yep. So it's dannyvega.ms on Instagram. That's where people can find me the most. Our website is www.fatfueled.family. So instead of fatfueledfamily.com, I know people want to do that. We couldn't get it. So fatfueled.family, that's where you can find the podcast. That's where you can find our programs, courses, coaching, all that stuff.
Awesome. I will definitely link those all in the show notes. This was so much fun. I want to do it again.
I know, me too. I know. Let's go, Rachel. I'm always down.
Yeah, I feel like we could just talk about everything forever. So we'll do another one. Maybe we'll do like a monthly, like just Q&A type thing. Because
I'm down. We could even bring you on ours for that too. I'm down for that. Oh, we got to talk about that. Adam has a really good idea that I want to share with you. I'll tell you about it.
Okay, sweet.
Yeah.
We'll chat. All right. I will talk to you soon.
All right, Rach. Good talking to you.
You too. Bye.
Bye.